Hello and welcome to the Roadmap for Riding Through Re-Entry webinar. I'm Helen Watts and I'm looking forward to spending the next 45 minutes or so with you and talking about my favourite subject, re-entry. I'm hoping you'll go away from this webinar more at ease with the stage of re-entry that you're at and with some tools to go on making your life easier. Please do make sure you've got a pen and a paper to hand to write down the things that we talk about, which you'll find useful later on. Are you feeling somewhat overwhelmed at the moment? It's very normal to feel all over the place when you're in the midst of re-entry, as we'll be talking about in a moment. It can be incredibly uncomfortable, can't it? So for today's session, here's an overview of what we're going to be looking at. Firstly, I'll spend some time helping you to understand the journey that you're on and find some markers to help you know where you are on that journey. Next, we'll take a look back at the past, the road behind you, to see what we can learn, what you can learn for the road ahead. Thirdly, we'll look at the foundations you have in your life, the things that give you stability and how you can build those up again where you are now. And lastly, we'll take a look towards the future, to what is ahead. Just before we get into the session now, I'm just going to share some of my own story, so you know how I came to be doing what I am doing now. My first time living overseas was in Germany as a student. I was studying mechanical engineering, and the third year of my course took me to study further in Hanover in northern Germany. And I loved it. The courses were more interesting. I loved the food, the people, got totally immersed in German culture, involved with various student groups and a local church choir. I lived in an international dorm, but spent most of my time with Germans. The culture was just so similar to who I felt I was. I just felt like I blended in and was more fully me than when I was in the UK. I was warned that coming back might not be easy, and I was very apprehensive about leaving, despite knowing I would be back in the same city as my boyfriend at the time, having been parted for a year. But it was tough. I had another year of my course to finish back in the UK, and it took me most of that time to feel like I had really settled back into life in the UK. A few years later, having married Duncan, and both of us with a vision for working overseas and not getting caught up in the rat race in the UK, but doing something more meaningful than that, we left for Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia. We were determined to make a difference and serve people in whatever way we could. We did a development course, all related to helping other people own their growth and see for themselves their own needs and act on them, rather than us telling them what we thought those were. We loved it and we loved that way of working, but really didn't have a chance to put it into practice, as team conflict led us to resigning and leaving after less than 2 years. This time round, the re-entry was pretty sudden. Having resigned, our organisation then gave us a week or so to pack up and leave. It was all we could do to say goodbye to those we'd got to know and then get on a plane. We landed back in the UK confused and not knowing where things were going to take us or how long it would take to find another organisation to go back with, only to be met at the airport by someone doing a survey. What's the harm in answering a few questions, we thought. Where are you from? She said. Where do you live? What do you do? At which point we told the lady that she'd best find somebody else. During that re-entry, Duncan suffered from depression, and it was a strange situation as we knew we wanted to go back, and it was only a matter of waiting until we could and going through the red tape of sorting things out. But our hearts and our minds were still in Kyrgyzstan, while our feet were in the UK. It meant we never really properly felt settled, always only that we were passing through. Even though we bought a house at that time, it still felt like we were just renting it. It was just a place to live. When we eventually went back, it was to a remote, isolated town 5 hours outside the capital city. I was in the early days of being a mum to our daughter and had quite an identity crisis with who I was and what I offered to the world apart from mummy brain. I did a whole mixture of things, from putting up a wind turbine, this is me measuring wind speeds and things to work out whether it would work or not, running parenting courses, this is the last group of ladies that I worked with, and my children in the front there, homeschooling, and mentoring short-term workers. After 4 years there, we got to the point where it was time to return, a whole host of reasons, but wanting to retrain being one of them. Before we left, though, we lived through a revolution, which left all the prisoners from the jails running riot in town, gunmen shooting randomly in the streets, and a personal threat from someone who wanted to buy our house but couldn't. We left in 2010, our children 6 and 4. We prepared ourselves well for returning. We read a number of books on re-entry and left on good terms with those around us. When we got back, we found that people weren't really interested in what we'd been doing, and people we had considered friends before or when we were back for a visit had moved on, or we'd changed so much that we couldn't relate anymore somehow. We were thoroughly overwhelmed with the number of decisions we had to make, from big things like careers down to the mundane like new toilet seats. We realised, though, that we had an opportunity to shape the next stage of our lives in a way that many people who stay put just don't. We could shape our future by taking time to work out where next and by setting goals which we step by step move towards. It made a massive difference to our feeling settled. I spent a couple of years, once we got back, struggling with depression. So it's my turn this time round. It was a culmination of a lot of stresses piling on top of each other, but I did learn an awful lot in coming through that. And I have a passion, which is making re-entry easier for others and helping people make the most of the opportunity presented by re-entry to evaluate life. I do most of my work currently for individuals, mission agencies and NGOs such as Tear Fund, but I'm well aware that there are many of you out there who don't get the same support when you return as the NGO sector gives, so would want to find ways of reaching out to you too. So the journey that we're on. This is a diagram or something similar that we were shown when we came back in 2010. I found it so helpful because it tied in with my own experience of feeling like life was in chaos. This diagram can be used when you go abroad as well as when you come back. But for the sake of argument here, let's take the left-hand side as where you are when you're settled in your host country. You're involved, you probably have a role of some sort, you're adjusted to being there, contributing to the community around you, have a status or reputation, whatever that might look like. Could be being the expat mum, or maybe the tough ones in an isolated situation, your job, all sorts of things. Whatever it is, it provides you with a sense of identity, knowing where and how you fit. At some point, the decision to leave is made. This is maybe made for you, maybe forced upon you. It's all the harder because then there's often little time for the goodbyes and finishing up that comes next. Assuming, though, that you make the decision and then have a year or 6 months to start thinking about going home, once you make that decision, life is never the same again. Did you notice how people's attitude towards you changed once you said that you were going home? A distancing from some. Others who wanted to spend as much time as possible together before you went. Others who wanted all your stuff, very cheaply. Anyway, that's all in the past because you're home now. But what I wanted to get across is this. That was when the chaos started, when your identity and rootedness started to be shaken. It wasn't just in coming back that this stuff happens. It starts before you ever leave. So, you're in the chaos phase. By the time you actually leave, it's full on. If you've been kicked out of somewhere and given a few days to leave, it's all a complete whirlwind. But even if you've had longer, it means you've had more of a chance to fill your head up with to-do lists, right? So you get on that plane. This is where the boat would have been so much better. Imagine even 45, 50 years ago, you would have gone home on a boat and taken 4 to 6 weeks to do it, if not longer. Now you get on a plane and wham, within 24 hours or less, you're on a different planet. To all intents and purposes, you look American, British, French, or whatever nationality you are, but on the inside, you feel a bit like a little green alien that hasn't got a clue how things function or what's changed since last you were back. So begins the repatriation chaos. To start with, you do have a hypothetical identity. You're the one who just came back from that foreign country. But within 3 to 4 weeks, that's worn thin, and people expect you to have moved on. Only just the beginning. It's a long time till you get to the right-hand side of the diagram, over here. A long time till you get there, once again feeling settled and involved. People say to allow 2 months for every year you've been away, but I've known people who adjust really quickly, and others who've been away only about 3 years who have taken at least 5 years to feel at home again. And life has a tendency to rocket out of control really quickly in that chaos phase. We have close friends who were in South America for a number of years. They came back, and in the first couple of months, they were faced with finding a nursing home for her mother, He was diagnosed with cancer. They had to get their kids into schools. They sold the house they'd been renting out and bought another, found the new one had rotting floorboards and had to replace them, and needed to find jobs. Nightmare. It sounds over the top, but I've heard so many stories like that, especially with in-laws and parents when we get back who've kind of held it together while we've been away, and then suddenly we get back and it's almost like they let go and things happen. It's really not that uncommon. I'm sure many of you have seen a kind of transition curve, re-entry curve before, when you were going overseas in the first place, perhaps. I say overseas because we're so small an island here in the UK that everything else is over a sea, unless you count Wales and Scotland, of course, but for better or worse, we don't count them as being particularly foreign. Sorry if being somewhere different isn't overseas for you. Bear with me. Anyway, here's the diagram, which applies equally when you go as when you return. First, the honeymoon phase, when everything is exciting and new. I came across someone's newsletter recently, written when she'd just gone overseas, and she was so obviously in that honeymoon phase, I wanted to share it with you. She says, I'm sat outside in my condi in the great, hot, glorious, hot sunshine, distracted by the colourful birds which I'm trying to identify, and the cheeky geckos popping up over my garden wall. I'm surrounded by beautiful trees and vibrant coloured tropical flowers. This is a beautiful place. When I arrived here, I went straight from the plane to get a local SIM card, queued to get the maximum amount of local currency, about £60, out of the ATM, did my grocery shopping at the supermarket and the local market, all before arriving at my new home. It just radiates with that initial excitement, doesn't it? You can feel like this when you first come back. Pleased to see people, to have those home comforts you'd missed, or eat that food you hadn't been able to get for so long. I remember food tasting just so good when we first came back. Broccoli, bacon, whatever it was, it tasted amazing. The honeymoon phase gradually, or rapidly, wanes into a more challenging phase of culture shock. Here's another quote from a lady who had definitely moved on from that honeymoon phase. She says, I've discovered a recently opened cinema here, a proper cinema, with popcorn and tiered seats and aircon. I watched Kung Fu Panda 2 in 3D. Amazing what you'll watch when you're desperate. I've had a lot of fun and have a great bunch of friends. However, the honeymoon period is definitely over. It hit me quite hard in my 4th month. I'm still 100% sure I'm in the right place, but it doesn't make it easy. Sometimes I crave normality. Oh, to be married, picking up kids from school and going to Tesco. Feel familiar? Then, after probably at least 6 months, if not a year or more, you reach a place of adjustment. Up here. Do you recognise those phases? In reality, it's never a smooth curve. More like this one I found on Google. Well, not quite like that, as I think the roller coaster gets less pronounced with time. We found the re-entry curve really helpful for our children. We drew a picture a bit like this first one, and we put it on our fridge, along with some emoticons in different places. So a really grumpy face down here, or sad face, and a happier one up here, and a really happy one up here. Lots of different ones around the curve. Anything that you could think of in between. And from time to time, one of us would point to the curve and say, I feel like that face today, which would prompt the rest of us to join in. And it was helpful for us as adults to recognise and affirm where our children were, and for all of us to see that all the different places were okay. Our children were quite young, at 6 and 4 when we came back, but I'm sure the principle could be applied for older kids, or done in a different way for them as well. Okay, so that's the journey you're on. The more you can understand what's behind your discomfort, the more easy it is in some ways to acknowledge and accept it for what it is, rather than feeling like you should be somewhere else or have it more together, or that there's something wrong with you. Just take a moment to write down what has been the most useful bit of this section that you'd like to remember and take away. Anything that's just jumped out at you as I've talked about it. Okay, moving on then. Using your past to help the present. We're going to think about this from 3 different perspectives: about mindset, loss, and seeking help. When I work with my one-on-one clients, I give them various exercises to do, which we then talk through together. I'm going to give you some of these, but since this is just a recording, you'll need to do the work for yourself. Talk it through with a friend or a partner afterwards if you like, as that will bring more value to the exercises. or somebody else that's also come back recently that you know of. I'll give you a bit of space to write things down, but do feel free to pause the recording and give yourself more time to process and think. Experience tells me you're less likely to come back and do it again than you are to focus on it now. Okay, so think back to your initial transition to your host culture, the country that you moved to. What are some of the words that you associate with that transition, with that initial stage of transition to your host culture? Jot them down. What are some of the words that you associate with that transition, that initial transition to your host culture? Then think about what habits, mindsets, or resources helped you most to settle there. And write those down too. What are the habits or the mindsets or the resources that helped you most when you were trying to settle in your host culture, the country that you were living in? And which of those might be helpful to you now? Or could you tweak a bit and use the principle of to help you now? Again, write some things down. If you can write them down, you're much more likely to remember them and use them. Which of those habits and mindsets that you used before could be useful to you now? Maybe things like imposing some sort of routine to each day, and forcing yourself to see someone each day, if only for a few minutes. Setting yourself small challenges each day for completion. What sort of things would be useful to you? Okay, thinking about loss. Who or what did you miss from your own culture when you went overseas in the first place? And how did you deal with your sense of loss? Again, just jot some things down. First things that come off the top of your head. There's no right, no wrong here. It's purely for you. Who or what did you miss most from your own culture when you went abroad? And how did you deal with your sense of loss? How we deal with a separation from what we know can be pivotal in how well we settle the other end. Obviously, you can take these away and mull them over some more after this session's over. Do continue to think on these things. So in what ways did the way, that's not great English, is it? But in what ways did the way that you dealt with it affect your transition? And the way that you dealt with that loss? I was chatting with a couple a few months ago who were struggling to settle in a new location, and it turned out they were spending huge amounts of time on social media to friends and family back home. While this in itself is not a bad thing, I do think too much can be a bad thing. The more time we spend in the virtual world away from our location, the more detached from it we can feel. Obviously, using social media to connect to others is an amazing thing and helps us with Facebook groups to connect with others going through similar experiences. But I would question using it too much, because it means we're not so emotionally present in our current location. I actually advised that couple to take a break from the social media for several months, having let family and friends know that they were going to do that, obviously, so that they can actually root and establish themselves. And the same can be true when we come home. Much as it's lovely Skyping and WhatsApping people on the other side of the globe, it can get out of hand and stop us from being here in the real world, here and now. So in what ways did the way that you dealt with your loss affect your transition? And what about now? What, if anything, would you like to do differently as you deal with your losses in this transition? It's always really painful, isn't it, leaving a country where you've adjusted and got lots of friends and different things that you have to leave behind, and you grieve when you leave. It's painful. What are the things you'd like to do differently as you deal with those losses, as you acknowledge those losses? And finally, in this section on using your past, seeking help. How did you seek out help? How did you do that when you arrived in your host culture? What worked? What didn't? What felt okay? What didn't? How did you seek out help when you arrived in your host culture? You know what I'm going to ask now, don't you? How are you seeking help right now? What has been most helpful to you? What are the ways that you could learn from how you sought out help before to how you seek out help now? All right. I feel like I'm throwing quite a number of things at you. Please do feel free to take these away and just work with them some more. Or maybe you've filled up the time that you've had anyway. Before we move on to the section on new foundations, I wanted to throw something else in here. You know the feeling you get when you're talking about your experiences overseas and you get met with one of those glazed overlooks? I think you probably know it all too well. Two things to throw into the mix here for you. One is how you tell your story. If you can, come up with a 2 to 3 sentence answer of how was your time in XYZ sort of question. The shorter and more quirky you can make it, the better. Include some deeper stuff, but also some very surface level stuff. Then whoever you're chatting to has the opportunity to ask more questions or go back to talking about their own stuff. And it gives you an opportunity to find out if they're interested. You would have thought that a question might have shown that, but no, it really doesn't. But hopefully you'll also get to avoid getting to that eyes glazed over phase. The other thing, prepare a couple of questions which are likely to be of interest to someone who's lived their life in your home culture. People are often quite threatened by people who've lived abroad, especially if it's outside of their experience. They just don't know what to ask or where to start or what that looks like. So if you sense their dis-ease, if you've got a couple of questions that you've prepared, you can immediately take it back over into some ground that they're more comfortable with. So in Britain, it might be about football, the latest football scores, or the recent Olympics, or where you are, it might be baseball or something going on in politics. Whatever it is that you hear people talking about, arming yourself with a couple of questions which can veer you onto something comfortable when you sense someone losing interest can make a big difference. And that's the other way, I guess, of talking about your story as well, is finding things that they'll connect with. So things about children's schooling or retirement or grocery shopping, things that they can really associate with. Those can be really good things to talk about. Okay, how are you doing? I'm throwing a lot of information at you and things to take away and think about. I hope it's resonating and helping. So on to new foundations. Again, this is something that was explained to us when we came back, and it made so much sense that I want you to get to grips with it too. Foundations are what help us to feel stable in our lives. Here's my little diagram of my life space when I came back from Kyrgyzstan. These were the things that had kept me stable when I was there and in a previous life before we went, okay? So for me, those are things like family, career, friends, home, hobbies, spiritual life. Now, when you do just a small move or move job, then maybe one of your foundations gets shaken, possibly two. When you come back from overseas, the whole lot gets thrown up in the air like the pieces of a jigsaw being muddled up. Suddenly, using my example, your extended family is nearer to you than ever before and have expectations of you that you didn't realize. You don't know what you're going to do next job-wise, or maybe you do, but it doesn't feel like a great fit. You've just left a bunch of friends behind, and though you may or may not know people in your new area, it will take time to work out who you will really relate to. You might be living out of boxes in someone else's house for several weeks, or not be able to move into your own for a while. The hobbies you found overseas may be different to what you would do with your leisure time back home. And if you're a spiritual person, Maybe you have some big questions which your host culture brought up for you, which you don't have answers to, and you don't feel like your local congregation get where you're at. Do you see how suddenly all of your foundations have been shaken and moved? And until some of these things start to come into some semblance of order, that feeling of unease that you have will continue. So, your job now. Write down on paper what you would class as your foundations. It might include some of the same ones that I used, maybe others, such as finances, health, well-being, personal development, physical environment, fun. You know what they are for you. What are the foundational areas of your life? If you come up with 6 or 8, just a few, come up with what you think are those foundations for you. Okay, once you've got some different headings, for now I just want you to pick out one area you want to work with. Don't try and do this with all these different foundations. You can look at the others after the call is over and work some more on those. But just think for one area, what are your current needs in that area? What's missing? How would you like it to be? What's hard? What would you like to change? What are those needs in those areas? So just pick one area, whether it's family, career, whatever it is on yours, the one that sticks out to you just now, and work with that one area. Just try and define what are your current needs in that area? What's missing? How would you like it to be? What's hard about that area? What would you like to change? Just jot some thoughts down, in much detail as you can, really, to just build a big picture of where you would like this one to be. How are you getting on? Have you got some current needs in each of those areas? If you're done with that, then what you could do is write down 2 or 3 small things that you could do in that area to make a difference and feel like you're moving forward. I think one of the things that is so hard is that life is so overwhelming and lots of things feel out of control. So trying to be very intentional about little things that can help make these areas better can make a massive difference to our state of mind. We just need to be small things. Obviously, we don't have control of everything around us, so there's certain things that we just can't do anything about. But if we're intentional about those things that we do have control of, we can make quite a difference to how we're feeling and that state of paralysis, which we can sometimes get into when it's all too overwhelming. And I would encourage you to put dates to when you do those things too. Again, the more intentional you are, the more likely you are to do them. So write down 2 or 3 small things. And again, once this call is over, you can write about the current needs and where you're at with each of the different foundations in your life, and then spend some time writing down 2 or 3 things that you could do in each area. So work with this quite a lot. It's really helpful for just setting some of those foundations down and starting to feel more settled. Okay, we're getting there. On to point 4, looking towards the future. Is your brain full yet? Sometimes one of the scary things about coming back is just how many unknowns there are in the future. If you can name some of those, it helps to take the scariness out of them and lessens the anxiety you might feel. So go ahead and look into the future. What are the things that are challenging you as you look that way right now? What have you yet to sort out? Which difficult relationships have you yet to brave? And who could you share those challenges with? It could be someone nearby or someone a distance away by Skype or something like that. These are the hard things about looking forward. What are those challenges that you see? Who are those elderly relatives that you still need to see? or those subjects that you need to broach with your extended family. Or you may be single and coming back and really not knowing anybody or who to share anything with and finding a place of belonging. All sorts of challenges can be ahead of you. What are the things for you that you see as you look over the next few months? What are you feeling anxious about or feeling are the challenges that you need to face? Sometimes just writing these things down or just acknowledging them to somebody else can make such a difference as to how they feel. So when you've been thinking about them for a bit, do go and share them with somebody else that you know. As I said, either somebody close by or somebody over Skype or something like that. And what are the opportunities that lie before you? What could you do differently now you're back? What new avenues could you explore? Who could you get to know that's been on your periphery for years, but you've never had the opportunity to get to know? One of the things I'm passionate about is making the most of the opportunity provided by re-entry to re-evaluate our lives. So often, if you just stay in one place, you get caught up in a career or life and don't stop to wonder if it's still the right thing or whether you could do anything differently. Let me encourage you to use this time to dream a bit. Give yourself permission to wonder what if without censoring that thought immediately. What could you do differently now you're back? What new opportunities could you explore? Who could you get to know? What could be involved in the next stage of your life? If you're creative, why not make a dream board, a corkboard or equivalent which you can cut out pictures or words on that strike a chord with you about your hopes and dreams. Cut them out from magazines, write them down, draw them, anything that you can attach to this board and just play with over time. Some people use Pinterest. Go for that if that's a way that you use to do it. Just spend some time looking at some different images or collecting things or seeing things when you're out for the day and writing it down or drawing it. Let your brain run free and tell you what you've been ignoring all these years. But give yourself some time to think about what those desires are that are in you, what you'd like for that next stage of your life. So, up until now, what has been the most important thing that you're going to take away from this webinar? Go ahead and write down what has had the most impact or been of most use to you. You're more likely to remember it if you write it down. Have I said that often enough yet? What's been the most important thing that you'll take away so far? In the survey I did a while ago, investigating the biggest issues that people face when returning from overseas, the things that came up time and time and time again were the following: reverse culture shock, facing loss, bureaucracy or logistics or getting everything done, being overwhelmed by choice, not knowing how things work, feeling misunderstood, certainly not understood, home or lack of a home when they initially come back, and helping children to settle. I hope I've gone some way to giving you some tools to help with some of these, most of them actually. The thing I really haven't touched on is children, but then probably one of the biggest things we can do to help our children is to help ourselves and be honest with them about our journey too. Oh, and a word about mums too, or those who are looking after children anyway. I realise in this day and age it doesn't always fall to the mums. Mums often suffer more culture shock later than the rest of their family. And this is because they're helping the other members of their family, their spouses, their children, to adjust and settle. And it can be a while later that they themselves feel the effects. Just something to bear in mind.